There are stories that bruise a community so deeply that even decades later, people still refuse to talk about them. Not because they've forgotten, but because remembering hurts too much. And what happened in Livonia, Michigan in November of 1987 is one of those wounds that never healed clean. It began with the kind of silence no one expects. Not the quiet of an early morning, but the kind of silence that feels wrong, the kind that makes your stomach tighten before your mind even understands why. A 26-year-old woman, lively, responsible, loved by everyone who crossed her path, simply didn't show up one morning. No explanation, no warning, no reason. Her name was Danica Morell, and she wasn't the type to disappear. She wasn't careless. She wasn't forgetful. She wasn't the kind of person who left people waiting, wondering, panicking. So when the sun rose that Saturday and she didn't walk out her front door, something inside the people who knew her began to crack. At first, it was a quiet worry, then irritation, then fear, and finally, a surge of anger that comes when your heart knows something terrible has happened and there's nothing you can do to stop it. Her best friend stood outside that house, knocking again and again, feeling panic clawing its way up her throat. The house looked untouched, calm, almost frozen in time. But there, by the door, sat a small suitcase, the same suitcase she used whenever she went to visit her parents. It was packed, ready, waiting. And that single detail cut deeper than any broken window or kicked-in door ever could. Because a packed suitcase means intention, preparation, a plan, and a plan doesn't simply evaporate. This was the moment an ordinary morning turned into a lifetime of questions. The moment a community lost its sense of safety. The moment a case began that would torment people for 34 long years. Before we go further, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. If you enjoy true crime stories like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and share it with someone who'd love it too. What still burns even now is how normal everything looked. That house on Farmington Road didn't show chaos. No overturned furniture, no shattered objects, no signs that someone fought for their life. And sometimes, that is the most terrifying sight of all. Because when something terrible happens, people expect noise, destruction, a mess that tells a story. But what do you do when everything looks undisturbed, yet someone is gone? The officers who walked inside that home felt it immediately. A strange heaviness in the air, not danger but grief. It was as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Her car was still outside. Her purse untouched. Her wallet, her ID, her daily essentials all right where she left them. Her keys hung in their usual spot. Her bed looked slept in, but neatly pulled back, as though she woke up expecting a normal day. Every sign pointed to a woman who planned to step outside, but never got the chance. But that suitcase, that single quiet object by the front door, was the part that carved itself into memory. Because a suitcase doesn't lie, people can misremember. Timelines can blur. Witnesses can contradict each other. But a packed bag tells the truth without speaking. Danica was supposed to leave. Something or someone stopped her mid-plan. And here's the part that still angers people in Michigan to this day. That suitcase wasn't treated like the warning flare it truly was. It should have been the loudest thing in that house. Instead, it was brushed off like a simple oversight, like it didn't matter. For years, that mistake let a nightmare sleep quietly in the shadows, while a family waited for answers that never came. Before we continue, ask yourself this. If someone in your area vanished without a sound, wouldn't you want every warning sign before danger reached your doorstep? Subscribe now, because staying unaware is the fastest way to get caught off guard. And if you still refuse to subscribe, drop a comment explaining why. Someone else might learn from your reason. What strikes people hardest about Danica's disappearance isn't the violence, it's the silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural, like the world paused for a moment and refused to say why. Because normally when someone is taken, the chaos tells the story. But here, there was no chaos. No forced entry. No broken lock. No overturned object. Nothing loud enough for a single neighbor to hear. It was as if the morning swallowed her whole. This is what enraged her loved ones most, the idea that she didn't even get the chance to scream. The idea that whatever happened took place in the span of a breath. One moment she was alive, the next, gone. No warning, no trace. Just a vacuum where a life used to be. Her best friend Brenda later said she felt something pull tight inside her chest that morning, a feeling she tried to push down, telling herself she was overreacting. She knocked harder, waited longer, convinced herself it was nothing. But deep down she knew, Danica didn't just miss a ride, something wrong was unfolding. The officers who responded didn't want to admit it, but the same thought ran through all of them. How can someone vanish from a quiet Michigan neighborhood without leaving a single mark? That question echoed for years. And every time a new lead failed, every time a new tip went nowhere, the same anger resurfaced, not just sadness but a deep, simmering frustration at the idea that someone out there knew exactly what happened and lived their life freely, comfortably, confidently. For 34 years, this is where the story becomes unbearable, because the truth didn't come from clues scattered across the community. It didn't come from a confession. It didn't come from a witness finally speaking up. It came much later, from science that didn't exist in 1987. And once that truth surfaced, it shocked not just Livonia but all of Michigan. The part that still angers people even today is how close the truth sat in front of everyone, untouched. The suitcase, that small, ordinary object, became the most mishandled clue in the entire case. A bag packed for a weekend trip shouldn't have been sitting by the door if she walked out willingly. A bag ready to go should have been in her car. But it wasn't. And that tiny detail, that single silent signal, should have changed everything. Instead, it was brushed aside. The officers believed she paused her leave. Her friends thought she might have changed her mind. Her family assumed she forgot something and stepped back inside. No one realized the truth. She never got the chance to finish what she started that morning. It wasn't until years later that this detail returned with a vengeance, a reminder that even the quietest clues can roar when time finally gives them a voice. Neighbors claimed they didn't hear anything unusual. Some remembered a dark sedan parked at the end of the street, but didn't think it mattered. Others swore they saw nothing at all. It's the kind of collective blindness that happens when a community feels safe, too safe. The kind of comfort that makes people dismiss small warnings, overlook odd moments, ignore their instincts. Because you never expect danger to pull up outside a house you've driven past 1,000 times. And that's exactly why Danica's case stung so deeply. The person responsible didn't need chaos to hide what he did. He used quiet. He relied on normalcy. He counted on people seeing nothing because they expected nothing. For decades, that assumption protected him. But while the investigation slept, guilt never left the people who loved her. Brenda, especially, refused to let Danica fade into a file box. Every year she stood in the same spot on Farmington Road, candles in hand, begging time to give her something, anything that could explain why her friend never walked out that door. She didn't know that the truth was coming. She didn't know that science would soon expose everything. She didn't know that a 3-4-year-old ghost was about to wake up and point straight at the man who took Danica's life. For years, Saturdays followed the same rhythm for Danica and Brenda. Same time, same ride. Same laughter echoing through the car as they headed toward their usual work shift. It was a habit so steady it didn't need reminders or alarms. It was simply understood. So when Brenda pulled into the driveway at 7:30 a.m. sharp, she wasn't expecting anything unusual. She turned off the radio, leaned back, and waited for Danica's familiar silhouette to appear at the door like it always did. But nothing happened. At first, Brenda didn't panic. She tapped the steering wheel, glanced at the dashboard clock, and told herself to relax. Maybe Danica overslept. Maybe she was looking for her keys. Maybe she was fixing her hair. Normal explanations, the ones we cling to when we don't want to imagine anything worse. But by 7:34, annoyance crept in. By 7:36, confusion. By 7:38, the kind of unease that makes your hands shake even when you try to hide it. Finally, Brenda stepped out of the car. The morning air felt sharp, biting at her skin. She walked toward the house, already calling out Danica's name before she reached the front steps. Still nothing. No footsteps. No movement behind the curtains. No sign that anyone inside was preparing for the day. Brenda's heartbeat sped up. This wasn't a friend running late. This wasn't a harmless delay. Something felt wrong, deeply wrong, and she couldn't shake it. Have you ever sensed danger before you had proof? That instinct you try to dismiss, only for it to tighten in your chest until you can't ignore it anymore? That was the feeling clawing at Brenda as she approached the door. Brenda knocked softly at first, expecting Danica to answer with that familiar half-awake smile. But when the seconds dragged on, her knocking turned harder, sharper, each hit echoing across the porch like a warning nobody wanted to hear. Still no response. She pressed her face a little closer to the window beside the door, trying to peer through the narrow gap where the curtain didn't fully meet the frame. At first glance, everything looked ordinary: the neat living room, the throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch, the small lamp still plugged in from the night before. But the stillness inside didn't feel peaceful. It felt hollow. Brenda tried the doorknob next, locked. Not unusual, but unsettling, when paired with the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She walked around the house slowly, her shoes crunching against the frost-dusted pavement. She checked the side window, then the kitchen window, wiping a circle on the glass with her sleeve to see better. Nothing. No movement. No shadow passing. No sense that anyone had been awake recently. When she circled back to the front door, her eyes fell on something she hadn't noticed from the car: the suitcase. Small, familiar. Positioned upright beside the door, as if waiting to be carried to the trunk. Her stomach dropped. That suitcase wasn't for work. It wasn't part of her daily routine. It was the one she used for visiting her parents, a trip she had mentioned the night before. So why would it be sitting here, untouched? A cold rush moved through Brenda's body. She stepped back, trying to make sense of the pieces that didn't fit together: the locked door, the motionless house, the silence. And that suitcase. Something about it felt wrong, disturbingly wrong. Brenda crouched beside the suitcase, her fingers hovering just above the handle without touching it. She recognized it instantly: the same one Danica always packed when she planned to see her parents. It was a small comfort that now felt like a punch to the chest. This wasn't a bag someone forgets. This wasn't something you leave behind after packing so carefully the night before. Danica was organized, predictable in the best way. If she placed that suitcase by the door, she fully intended to walk out with it. So why hadn't she? A slow, rising dread crawled up Brenda's spine. Logic tried to argue. Maybe Danica got distracted. Maybe she ran back inside to grab something. Maybe she took a phone call. But Brenda knew her better than anyone. There was no world where Danica would leave a packed suitcase untouched at the exact moment she was supposed to walk out and meet her. Her breathing grew unsteady as her mind replayed their conversation from the night before, Danica laughing, promising she'd be ready on time, talking about the weekend with her parents. Nothing in her tone hinted at fear, stress, or hesitation. Nothing sounded off. Nothing warned what was coming. And that's what made the situation feel so cruel. There were no signs, no build-up, no slip in her routine, just a sudden break in a pattern that had never broken before. Brenda checked the car again, hoping for something, anything that made sense, but the Plymouth Horizon sat in the driveway exactly where Danica always left it. Keys inside the house. Car in place. Suitcase waiting. Front door locked. Everything pointed to an interrupted moment. A moment so quick, so silent, so sudden, it left nothing behind. Her voice cracked as she whispered Danica's name one more time, the word barely leaving her lips. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Brenda stepped back from the door, her breath unsteady as she scanned the driveway again, hoping for some clue she'd somehow missed. But the scene refused to change. The stillness around her felt heavier now, pressing at her chest like a weight she couldn't push off. She tried to call Danica's name again, louder this time, her voice cracking through the quiet street. No answer. No movement behind the curtains. No sound from inside the house. Just silence that felt crueler with every passing second. Her frustration shifted into something sharper: fear mixed with anger. Anger that Danica wasn't answering. Anger that nothing made sense. Anger that her instinct was screaming while everything around her looked untouched. She rushed to the side of the house again, checking the windows a second time even though she knew it was pointless. Each pane reflected the same still interior, untouched and unmoving. She cupped her hands against the glass, searching for any sign of life, but saw only her own worried reflection staring back at her. She returned to the front porch, feeling the early morning chill cutting deeper than before. Her eyes locked once more on the suitcase, the one detail she couldn't shake. That bag should have been in the trunk. It should have been part of a normal morning. Instead, it felt like a warning no one wanted to recognize. Brenda's heart sank as a single thought hit her so hard, she actually stumbled. She never made it out. That realization struck like a blow, sudden, painful, undeniable. Nothing about this morning was normal. Nothing about the silence felt harmless anymore. Her gaze moved to the driveway. Danica's car sat perfectly still, untouched. And that was when the final piece clicked into place. Her car was still there. So where was Danica? The missing person report hit the Livonia Police Department before noon, and the moment it reached the desk of Detective Alistair Fincham, his stomach tightened. Cases like this didn't usually come in on quiet Saturday mornings. They arrived with chaos, shouting, frantic family members crowding the lobby. But this one came in with nothing but a single phone call and a tone of fear the dispatcher couldn't shake. Fincham drove to Danica's home with a knot forming in his chest. He'd handled countless disappearances, but something about this one bothered him before he stepped out of the car. Maybe it was the silence around the street. Maybe it was the uncertain look in Brenda's eyes as she stood on the porch. Maybe it was the kind of dread that shouldn't exist this early in an investigation. When he reached the front door, Brenda repeated what happened: the knocking, the unanswered calls, the locked door, the suitcase. Fincham listened closely, jotting notes, but it was the fear behind her words that got his attention, fear she wasn't trying to hide anymore. He asked her to walk him through the house from the outside. She pointed out each window, the areas she checked, the places she hoped to see movement but didn't. Every detail lined up with something dire. A woman who woke up like it was any other morning, and then vanished. Fincham stepped inside with the responding officers, and the moment he crossed the threshold, the stillness felt wrong. Not peaceful, just hollow. The kind of quiet that told him nothing happened here that morning, because Danica never got far enough to make a sound. He scanned the living room. Nothing out of place. No overturned objects. No forced entry. And that meant something far worse. Whoever stopped Danica didn't need to break in. They walked through the front door, or she let them in. The officers spread through the house with measured steps, eyes scanning every corner, hoping for something, anything that might explain Danica's disappearance. But the home felt frozen, as if she had stepped out for a moment and simply never returned. Her purse sat on the counter, unzipped just enough to show her wallet and ID inside. Nothing missing, nothing disturbed. Fincham checked the back door next, and there they were, her keys, still hanging on the little wooden hook she used every day. She hadn't left through the back. She hadn't rushed. She hadn't panicked. Her bedroom looked untouched except for the slight impression on the bed where she slept hours earlier. The blanket was folded back neatly. Her slippers still by the bedside. No sign she hurried. No sign she was interrupted in the middle of anything. But the living room. That's where Fincham paused. The suitcase. He crouched down beside it, studying it the way a surgeon studies something he doesn't want to admit is fatal. A packed bag sitting inches from the door at the exact time a woman disappears is not a coincidence, it's a message. But messages weren't useful unless someone could read them correctly. Brenda stood near the doorway, tears forming as she tried to steady herself. "She wouldn't leave without telling me," she whispered. "Not like this, not ever." Fincham didn't respond at first because he agreed. This wasn't someone walking away from their life. This was someone being stopped mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-plan. The officers finished their initial sweep and regrouped in the living room. No forced entry, no signs of a struggle, no trail to follow. The quiet inside the house was almost mocking. Cases didn't usually start with nothing, but this one did. And Fincham felt something settle in his gut, something heavy, something he didn't want to name. Whoever took Danica knew exactly what they were doing. Fincham stepped outside with his notepad as the officers began canvassing the neighborhood. If the house wouldn't talk, maybe the street would. But what he encountered was something far stranger than a typical missing person inquiry. People weren't confused. They weren't dismissive. They were uneasy, unnerved in a way they struggled to put into words. The first neighbor he approached, an older woman across the street, kept glancing toward Danica's home as if expecting someone to appear at the window. She swore she heard nothing unusual that morning, no shouting, no thud, no door slamming. "Just quiet," she said, her voice trembling. Too quiet. Another neighbor mentioned seeing a car the night before, a dark sedan idling near the corner. He assumed it belonged to someone visiting the houses nearby, so he didn't think twice. But when Fincham asked him to describe the driver, the man stiffened. "Didn't get a clear look," he muttered. But something about it felt off. He couldn't explain why. Several others reported the same thing, an unfamiliar car in a neighborhood where people instantly recognized anything out of place. A vehicle nobody could fully describe. A driver nobody really saw. A moment everyone dismissed until now. Piece by piece, Fincham felt a cold certainty building. Someone watched that street. Someone waited for the right moment. Someone moved with purpose, not panic. But there were no footprints. No tire marks clear enough to match. Nothing left behind except gaps in people's memories. It frustrated him, not just the lack of evidence, but the sense that something significant was hiding between all these half-remembered details. He closed his notebook, staring down the empty street, feeling the weight of the morning settle harder on his chest. Something happened here. Something calculated. Something no one noticed in time. Back inside the house, Fincham stared at the suitcase again, refusing to let it fade into the background the way everyone else had. Something about it anchored the entire timeline. A packed bag by the door signaled intention, a next step she never got to take. Brenda stood beside him, gripping her coat with both hands as if holding herself together. "She was supposed to leave with me," she said quietly. "We were supposed to go together. How does someone just disappear before taking one step outside?" Fincham didn't answer. He couldn't. Every detail pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to voice aloud. No struggle. No forced entry. No sound. No warning. Someone stopped her before she even reached her car. He moved from room to room again, slower this time, as if the walls might finally admit what they'd seen. But each space stared back at him with a silence that made his skin crawl. A woman vanished inside her own mourning, and the house refused to give up. Why? That kind of disappearance doesn't happen by accident. It happens because someone planned it well enough that no one heard a thing. Fincham stepped out onto the porch again, anger flaring. Someone was here, he muttered under his breath. Someone who knew exactly how to move without leaving a trace. And this is the part viewers hate to hear. Most people miss danger because they think it can't reach them. That illusion is how people vanish without a sound. Most people miss danger because they think it won't touch them. Don't make that mistake. Subscribe now before the next detail slips past you. And if you're choosing not to subscribe, comment why. Seriously, what's holding you back? Fincham tightened his jaw as he looked at the house one last time. Something or someone stopped her before she reached her car. The first direction Fincham pursued was the one that made the most sense on paper: Danica's workplace. If someone wanted to harm her, the trail might start with co-workers or clients. But the deeper he went, the more the leads crumbled beneath him. Her supervisor described her as reliable, focused, and never involved in disputes. Not a single complaint on record. No confrontations, no late-night calls from angry clients, nothing that hinted at danger waiting for her beyond the office parking lot. Fincham interviewed everyone who interacted with her regularly. Co-workers, security staff, even the maintenance crew. Every conversation ended the same way. She was kind. She was predictable. She kept to herself. She had no enemies. And that's what made it maddening. A case this serious shouldn't have a starting point this blank. Fincham dug further, requesting project files, schedules, and reports from the last month she worked. He found nothing unusual, no disagreements, no suspicious visitors, no strange calls logged by the receptionist. He even looked through weeks of building access logs, a tedious task, only to find the same predictable timestamps from Danica, morning after morning. No anomalies, no sudden shift in her schedule. It was like investigating someone who lived a quiet, steady life, with no cracks for danger to slip though. Yet somehow danger found her anyway. By the end of the day, Fincham sat in his cruiser gripping the steering wheel, irritation building. A job should have offered connections, motives, secrets. Instead, it offered him a wall. A blank, unforgiving wall. If something threatened Danica, it didn't come from her career, which meant whatever happened to her came from somewhere else. Somewhere much closer. When the professional angle collapsed, Fincham turned to the part of Danica's life people always hesitate to talk about, the people she let close to her heart. Romance can open doors to motives no workplace ever reveals. The first person he met was Dennis, the ex. He arrived with a stiff posture and a tight jaw, clearly irritated by the questions. He insisted their split was mutual, nothing dramatic, nothing ongoing. He said all the right words, but his tone didn't match his expression. Still, when asked where he was the morning Danica vanished, his alibi checked out clean. No holes. No hesitation. Next came Gavin, the new interest. He looked genuinely shaken when Fincham told him Danica was missing. His hands trembled, his voice cracked, and he struggled to keep composure as he described their growing closeness. But emotions don't equal guilt, and Fincham knew better than to rely on appearances. Gavin's timeline was verified too. Solid. Uncomplicated. Fincham ordered polygraphs for both men, hoping one of them would slip, even just a little. He needed something, a crack, a misstep, a tell, but the results only added another layer of frustration. Inconclusive. Inconclusive. Both of them. Not lies. Not truth. Just useless static from a machine that couldn't give him what he needed. The emotional angles were supposed to help narrow the path. Instead, they scattered it. Nothing tied back to jealousy, nothing linked to rage, nothing even hinted at someone losing control. It was becoming painfully clear. If a man was involved in Danica's disappearance, it wasn't someone she dated. It wasn't someone she trusted. It was someone she didn't see coming. By the end of the first week, Fincham felt the pressure closing in from every direction. Families wanted answers. The department wanted progress, and the community wanted reassurance. But the truth was far colder. He didn't have the tools to chase a ghost. There were no doorbell cameras to review, no cell tower records to trace, no digital footprints to follow. If someone disappeared in 1987, all you had were witnesses, instinct, and whatever scraps of physical evidence the scene was generous enough to offer. And Danica's home offered almost nothing. The dark sedan reported by neighbors? No license plate. No clear description of the driver. No way to track where it came from or where it went. Fincham tried to build a grid of possible routes the car could have taken, marking them on a paper map spread across his desk. But every potential path branched into another, and another, until the lines resembled panic more than strategy. He ordered the small collection of physical evidence to be processed. Fibers. Prints. Anything that might hold a clue. But in the late 80 seconds, forensics was a blunt tool. Partial prints couldn't be run through a national database. Fibers couldn't be matched to manufacturers. DNA wasn't even an option. Every limitation felt like a slap. He returned to Danica's house again and again, searching for something he might have missed, a detail overlooked, a sign hidden in plain sight. But every walkthrough ended the same: quiet rooms, untouched surfaces, and the weight of a woman who vanished without leaving a trail. The case wasn't moving forward. It wasn't even standing still. It felt like it was sinking fast. And Fincham's frustration twisted into something deeper. It felt personal now. As days stretched into weeks, the pressure around the investigation tightened like a vice. Livonia was no longer the quiet, predictable place it had always been. People who once left their doors unlocked now triple-checked every latch. Parents walked their children to the bus stop instead of letting them go alone. Neighbors who used to wave from across the yard now stared at unfamiliar cars with suspicion. One disappearance had shaken an entire community. Brenda could barely sleep. She called Fincham constantly, hoping for news, begging for updates, clinging to the hope that someone somewhere had seen something they simply hadn't shared yet. Each time he answered the phone, guilt settled heavier on his shoulders, because he had nothing new to tell her. Every lead that appeared promising turned out to be smoke. Every tip that sounded urgent dissolved into confusion. People claimed they saw someone who looked like Danica, then changed their minds hours later. A reported out-of-state sighting collapsed within minutes of questioning. Even the dark sedan that once seemed like the biggest clue faded into a story with no shape. And with each failure, Fincham felt himself slipping deeper into the case. He stayed long after his shift ended. He skipped meals. He stopped answering personal calls. He stared at the same evidence night after night, hoping it would finally speak to him. But silence was the only answer he received. By the third month, the tone in the station shifted. Whispered conversations, uncomfortable glances, and the unspoken truth no detective ever wants to hear. The trail was dying. Fincham refused to admit it. He fought it with every ounce of stubbornness he had left. But even he could feel the temperature dropping around the case file. And then, the case froze. By 1988, Danica's disappearance had shifted from a breaking story to a painful memory the city didn't know how to carry. The posters that once covered telephone poles began to curl at the edges, sun-faded and ignored by people rushing through their daily routines. The hotline that once rang non-stop grew quieter with each passing week, until eventually it stopped ringing at all. And slowly, painfully, Livonia began returning to the rhythm it had before she vanished. School buses ran on schedule again. Shops reopened their usual chatter. Neighbors who once gathered on porches to share theories now avoided the topic entirely, because for many, it hurt too much to admit they had no answers. But while the city tried to move forward, the people closest to Danica were left trapped in the same moment the morning she never made it outside her front door. Brenda felt that weight the most. Everywhere she went, she expected to see Danica for a split second crossing a street, stepping out of a store, laughing in a crowd. And every time reality corrected her, it hit like a new wound. She learned to carry her grief quietly, but it never softened. It just settled deeper. Every November 14th she started a tradition. She stood at the same corner near Danica's street, holding a single candle long after the flame flickered in the cold wind. Sometimes others joined her. Sometimes she stood there alone. But she refused to let the world forget her friend. Have you ever held on to hope longer than anyone else? The kind of hope that hurts to keep, but hurts even more to let go? That was Brenda's life now, living in a city that moved on without her, while she clung to the one person time refused to return. For Detective Alistair Fincham, the cold case shelf wasn't just a filing cabinet, it was a graveyard of unfinished stories, and the file labeled Danica Morell missing weighed heavier than all the others combined. He visited it often. At first, he did it out of duty, rereading statements and searching for angles he might have missed in the chaos of the early investigation. But over time, it became something different, a private ritual, a reminder of the one case that refused to bend, no matter how hard he pushed. Every lead that collapsed replayed in his mind on a loop. Every unanswered question followed him home at night. Every quiet moment reminded him of the silence inside Danica's house the first day he stepped inside. He'd sit alone at his desk, long after the station emptied, flipping through pages that offered no comfort. He studied the same photographs, the same sketches, the same timeline until the ink itself felt like it was mocking him. People around him tried to help. They told him he'd done everything he could. They told him some cases don't resolve. They told him time might eventually bring answers. But he didn't believe any of it. He carried the weight of failure like it belonged to him alone. And the older the case grew, the heavier that weight became. Even on the day he retired, the folder stayed under his arm, pressed to his chest like it was the last piece of unfinished business he refused to abandon. He packed up his badge, cleared his desk, shook a few hands, but the only thing he felt was regret. Deep, unspoken regret. Some people walk away from their careers with pride. Fincham walked away with a ghost. While the detectives rotated, the leads dissolved, and the city learned to live with unanswered questions, one person refused to let Danica's story fade into the background. Brenda. She carried the case on her shoulders with a loyalty that didn't weaken, not in 1988, not in 1996, not in 2004. She guarded Danica's memory the way someone protects a fragile flame in a storm. Even when people stopped bringing up the disappearance in conversation, Brenda kept it alive in her own way. She wrote letters to local newspapers every anniversary, asking them to reprint Danica's photo. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But she kept writing. She checked in with the police station once a month, even when she knew the answer wouldn't change. She kept Danica's phone number saved in her contacts, even after the line was long disconnected. Every time she walked past a crowded place, a grocery aisle, a bus station, a park, she caught herself scanning faces, looking for the impossible, hoping for a miracle she knew time would never give her. The vigil she held each year slowly grew into something the community recognized. A few neighbors joined. Then a few more. Some came to show support. Others came because they, too, felt the guilt of those early days, the guilt of assuming someone else would notice the important details. One candle, then 5, then dozens. And through all those years, through fading photographs and changing seasons, one question stayed with Brenda like a shadow she couldn't shake. What was missed? Because something didn't sit right. Something felt unfinished. Something about the evidence, the old reports, the early assumptions refused to stay quiet in her mind. Some evidence refuses to stay silent. And soon, time would prove her right. By 2021, the world had changed in ways the original investigation could never have imagined. Entire cases were being solved with digital trails, genetic mapping, and tools that didn't exist when Danica vanished. But one thing hadn't changed. Her file still sat in the cold case room, quietly waiting for someone who wouldn't walk past it. Detective Regina Thorne was that person. New to the department yet known for her relentless approach, she wasn't the type to be intimidated by a file thick with failure. She chose her cases with purpose, and when she saw Danica's photograph clipped to the front of the folder, she didn't look away. Something about the stillness in that image pulled at her. She spread the entire case across her desk. Transcripts, reports, statements, sketches, the early theories that went nowhere. Across all those pages, one detail stood out like it was begging for attention: the suitcase, the bag that never left the house. The one detail that hinted at an interrupted moment. Regina wasn't easily rattled, but as she read, a tightness grew in her chest. Not fear, anger. Anger that a woman could vanish so cleanly that an entire generation of investigators had been left empty-handed. She pulled the old evidence box toward her, its edges worn, its label nearly faded. Inside sat the artifacts collected in 1987, untouched for decades, waiting for technology that hadn't existed at the time. Old cases don't scare investigators like Regina. They ignite them. She laid out each item carefully, her eyes narrowing as she realized something many had overlooked. These objects weren't useless. They were time capsules. And time finally had the tools to open them. This wasn't just a review. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Regina lifted the lid from the evidence box the way some people open a letter they've avoided for years, slowly, cautiously, with the knowledge that whatever was inside had waited far too long to be heard. Dust rose in a thin cloud, carrying with it the weight of a case frozen in time. The first item she pulled out was the doorknob swab from 1987, sealed in a brittle plastic container. Back then it held no answers. In 2021 it was a different story. She sent it straight to the forensic lab for reanalysis. Modern scanning, enhanced imaging, advanced chemical lifting tools that didn't exist even in the early 2000s could now extract value from prints once dismissed as unusable. Next came the suitcase, the very object that had haunted detectives for decades. Regina studied it with a sharp and focused stare. The handle showed slight wear, the fabric preserved surprisingly well. She wasn't just looking at a personal belonging, she was looking at an object that held the final moment Danica tried to control her own day. She ordered a touch DNA test on the handle, zipper, and inner lining, procedures unheard of when the case first broke. Even the slightest trace of skin cells could produce a profile if the sample cooperated. Hours later, the lab called. A partial print emerged from the doorknob, clearer than anyone expected. And the suitcase? It held male touch DNA. Not a relative, not a co-worker, not any known friend or acquaintance. Someone else had been inside that house. Regina leaned against her desk, letting the truth settle in with a force she hadn't prepared for. The past wasn't silent. It had been waiting for science to finally speak its language. And whoever left that DNA behind, they'd hidden their secret for 34 years. The lab didn't take long to isolate the genetic markers from the suitcase sample. The moment Regina received the call, she left her chair so fast it nearly rolled into the wall behind her. Cases like this rarely give breakthroughs, and when they do, detectives learn to brace themselves. She rushed upstairs to the lab's glass-walled analysis room, where the technician pointed to the digital display. A full profile wouldn't form, but what they had was enough. A male DNA signature, consistent, strong, and impossible to dismiss. Regina's pulse kicked up. Someone touched that suitcase. Someone who shouldn't have. She asked the only question that mattered. Run it through CODIS. The technician nodded and initiated the search. The system scanned the national database with a speed that would have seemed impossible in the 80 seconds. Regina watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, each passing second stretching the room tighter and tighter. Finally, the result. No match. Not a partial hit. Not a near miss. Nothing. A complete unknown. Regina didn't blink at first. She just stared at the screen, jaw tightening as the reality sank in. Whoever left that DNA wasn't in the system. They'd never been arrested, never been flagged, never had their genetic footprint tied to a crime. A man capable of making someone disappear had lived his entire life without leaving a trace in any database. That wasn't luck. That was discipline. And it raised a chilling possibility. If someone can hide this well for decades, what else are they capable of hiding? Regina exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Imagine hiding a secret so deep that even modern science struggles to find you. This wasn't just a clue. It was a warning. And it was only the beginning. Regina stood alone in the evidence room long after the lab closed for the night. The dim overhead light hummed quietly as she studied each piece of the case spread across the table. It was as if the past had suddenly cracked open and started spilling truths no one was ready for. The partial print on the doorknob. The male-touch DNA on the suitcase. The fact that neither belonged to anyone in Danica's circle. This wasn't random. This wasn't accidental. This was deliberate contact from a man who had no reason to be inside her home. Regina reached for the timeline next, dragging her pen across dates that once felt settled. Now they twisted into something far more complicated. Whoever touched that suitcase had been close enough, calm enough, to leave a sample without fear. She replayed the early witness statements in her mind. The dark sedan. The quiet street. The lack of forced entry. Details that once felt disconnected now pulsed with new meaning. This man didn't break in. He didn't rush. He moved with intent. Regina leaned over the table, eyes sharp with the realization that the case had shifted. This wasn't about reconstructing a chaotic event. This was about identifying someone who operated with complete control, someone who thought he'd buried his tracks so deep that time itself would protect him. But time had changed. Science had evolved, and hiding was no longer as easy as it used to be. She sat down, opened her laptop, and began drafting the next step, a request that would take the investigation into territory old detectives could have never imagined. Genetic genealogy. If the man who took Danica had lived in silence this long, his bloodline might expose him. The past was no longer still. It was awake, and it was ready to name him. Genetic genealogy isn't magic, it's patience, pattern reading, and the courage to follow threads most detectives never touch. Regina knew that once she chose this path, there would be no turning back. It meant combing through the living echoes of a stranger's bloodline, looking for the one person whose existence could finally explain Danica's disappearance. She started by uploading the unknown male DNA profile into genealogical databases used by law enforcement. These systems weren't designed to give immediate answers. They offered pieces, slivers, connections, so distant they barely seemed real. Second cousins, third cousins, matches that shared only fragments of history. Days passed before the first meaningful hit arrived. A third cousin match. Weak on its own, but powerful in the right hands. The kind of clue that didn't point directly to a suspect, but whispered, "Start here." Regina's screen filled with family names stretching across decades, births, marriages, migrations, deaths. Unlike traditional detective work, this wasn't about following a suspect's movements. It was about following their ancestors, their roots, their origins, their hidden branches. She built chart after chart, connecting the third cousin match to old census lines, archived marriage records, and forgotten newspaper listings. The web expanded, then tightened, and then slowly narrowed. One branch stood out, not because it was suspicious, but because everything else eliminated itself. Wrong age. Wrong location. Wrong generation. Except for one line of men, all living in the Midwest, all of the right age range, all connected to the same family tree. Regina leaned closer to the screen as the names lined up. 3 brothers. 5 sons. A cluster of distant uncles. But among them, one name stood taller than the rest, not because of something he did, but because nothing about him appeared anywhere. Arthur Jensen. The man whose absence from public records felt louder than anyone's presence. And Regina knew. This wasn't coincidence. This was the beginning of the truth, pulling itself out of hiding. Once Regina identified the narrow branch of the family tree, she began sorting through the lives it held, tracing marriages, relocations, and the children who followed. Genealogy feels slow from the outside, but from Regina's chair, it felt like chasing a moving shadow. Every new document she uncovered shifted the lines a little more, revealing patterns that were impossible to ignore. Birth records led her to one cluster of relatives living in Michigan during the late 1982. Employment files confirmed that several of them worked within 15 miles of Danica's home. Old property records revealed addresses that overlapped with her daily commute. Piece by piece, she built a generational map of a family that had unknowingly carried the answer for more than 30 years. But one man kept circling back into view. Arthur Jensen. A name that appeared rarely, almost too rarely. No social media. No job listings. No public photos. Just fragments. A high school yearbook appearance, an old utility bill, and a single hunting license application from the early 90s. The absence bothered Regina more than anything else. Most people leave trails without realizing it: bills, registrations, medical visits, online accounts. But Arthur was the exception. He drifted through the records like a ghost, present enough to exist but quiet enough to hide. She dug deeper. Every other male in the branch either lived out of state during the time of the disappearance, was too young, or had confirmed work logs placing them elsewhere. One by one they fell away, leaving Arthur standing alone. The genealogical chart that once looked chaotic now pointed directly at him. Regina leaned back in her chair, feeling the room shrink around her. If the DNA didn't name him, the family line certainly did. Arthur wasn't just a possibility. He was the path the evidence was forcing her to follow. Regina spread Arthur Jensen's minimal records across her desk, each scrap feeling heavier than a full file ever could. The more she looked at him, the more unsettling the picture became. He didn't stand out because of what he did, he stood out because of what he never appeared to do. No consistent employment history. No long-term address. No medical records past the early 2000s. No digital trail of any kind. A life without footprints. That wasn't normal. Not in the 82nd. Not in the 2000s. Not now. Most people leave accidental imprints everywhere. They buy things online, sign leases, register cars, pay fines, subscribe to services, visit clinics, appear in directories. Even the most private people still leave traces. But Arthur didn't. He wasn't invisible, he was evasive. Regina's pen tapped against the desk as she studied a narrow column of names. Arthur, his brothers, and their sons. Everyone else had alibis backed by paperwork. Everyone else had timestamps proving where they were when Danica vanished. Everyone else had some form of accountability. Except him. Arthur slipped through decades of documentation like someone who learned early how to stay unnoticed. That alone wouldn't convict him, but paired with the DNA trail, the family line, and the total silence around his life, it pushed him to the top of Regina's list with frightening clarity. She watched the fan spin lazily on the ceiling, the weight of her realization settling on her like a cold hand gripping the back of her neck. If this case already shocks you, subscribe. Missing the next reveal isn't an option. And if you still choose not to subscribe, drop a comment and explain why. Because what Regina was about to uncover would change everything. She had a name. She had a branch. But she needed the one thing that could turn suspicion into truth. Arthur Jensen's DNA. By the time Regina finished mapping the Jensen branch, her office walls were lined with pinned documents, old census pages, faded yearbook photos, address histories, and notes marked with thick red strokes. The quiet room felt alive with the pressure of a truth just out of reach. Arthur Jensen wasn't hiding in chaos. He was hiding in the quiet, the kind of quiet that takes intention. Regina reviewed the timeline again. He lived in Michigan during the late 82nds. He worked odd jobs that never required paperwork. He moved frequently enough to stay overlooked but not suspicious. And more importantly, he was the only adult male in that branch who couldn't be placed anywhere on the morning Danica disappeared. Everything pointed toward him. Everything except the one thing that mattered most. A confirmed DNA match. Regina stared at the evidence board, her jaw tightening. The unknown male profile pulled from the suitcase could be matched directly to Arthur, but only if she could get his DNA. And collecting it wouldn't be simple. Arthur wasn't in the system. He had no criminal record. He kept to himself and rarely appeared in public. He never volunteered for medical research or ancestry tests. He moved like someone who understood that the less you leave behind, the harder you are to catch. Regina knew what it meant. She couldn't bring him in. She couldn't question him. She couldn't even put him under official suspicion without proof. She needed his DNA, and she needed to get it without tipping him off. But how do you collect DNA from a man who has stayed hidden for 34 years? That question hung in the air like a challenge. A challenge Regina was ready to accept. Regina didn't bother with a formal briefing. She simply handed the team a folder with Arthur's name on the front and said, "We watch him, we learn him, we wait." Surveillance started the next morning. Arthur Jensen lived in a modest neighborhood tucked behind a row of aging storefronts, the kind of place where people nod politely but rarely ask questions. To anyone passing by, he looked harmless. A middle-aged man with a stiff walk, a plain wardrobe, and the kind of face you forget as soon as you look away. He left his house at predictable times. He visited the same grocery store twice a week. He walked the same route every afternoon. He bought the same pack of mints from the gas station on Fridays. Nothing about him screamed danger. And that was the problem. Regina watched through a long-range lens as he strolled down the sidewalk with a slow, almost deliberate calm. No paranoia, no glancing over his shoulder, no sign he sensed a tail. Predators who survive decades without being caught often have one thing in common. They learn how to blend in. And Arthur blended so well, he nearly disappeared in plain sight. The team followed him in shifts, documenting his routine, waiting for any slip, any moment where he discarded something that could hold DNA. But days passed without a single opportunity. Arthur didn't litter. He didn't stop to drink or eat outside. He didn't toss receipts or packaging. It was as if he'd built his life around not leaving traces. Regina felt the pressure building. Patience was part of the job, but so was knowing when a window was about to open and when it might slam shut forever. She whispered to herself as she watched him from the car, "How many people have you walked past who hide secrets like this?" The hunt had begun, but Arthur wasn't making it easy. By the end of the first week, Regina felt something unsettling settle in her gut. Arthur's routine wasn't just predictable, it was polished. No wasted movements, no sudden choices, no stray habits that could be exploited. He lived like a man who knew eyes could be on him at any moment. Too careful. Too controlled. Too aware for someone who claimed to be ordinary. He left home at the exact same time each morning, locking his door with a slow, practiced motion. He walked the same 3 blocks to a small diner, always ordered the same breakfast, always paid in cash, and always wiped his hands on a napkin before standing up. Every action felt rehearsed. The team watched him sit alone at a table by the window, eating in silence. He barely spoke to the staff. Never chatted with other customers. Never lingered after finishing his meal. One detective leaned toward Regina during surveillance and murmured, "He's either the most boring man alive or the most deliberate." Regina didn't answer, but she knew which one she believed. They followed him to the park next, where he sat on the same bench each afternoon, staring at the pond without expression. Children played nearby. Dogs barked. Joggers passed. Arthur remained perfectly still, almost disconnected from the world around him. What bothered Regina most wasn't his quietness, it was the absence of spontaneity. People change their routines over time. They shift habits, adjust schedules, break patterns without realizing it. Arthur never did. No coffee cups discarded. No food wrappers left behind. No items dropped on accident. He behaved like a man who had spent decades making sure he left nothing behind for anyone to find. Regina tightened her grip on the steering wheel. A routine this clean wasn't natural. It was constructed. And that meant one thing. Arthur Jensen knew exactly how to stay hidden. On the 12th day of surveillance, something finally changed, not because Arthur grew careless, but because the world around him shifted just enough to open a tiny window. Regina and her team watched him enter a small corner cafe instead of his usual diner. It was unusual, completely out of pattern. For the first time in almost 2 weeks, Arthur broke his routine. He ordered a hot coffee, no sugar, no cream, and sat near the back, away from the windows. Regina watched from the unmarked car outside, heart thudding with a mix of hope and caution. This could be nothing, or it could be the moment she'd been waiting for. Arthur drank slowly, calmly, as if he had all the time in the world. When he stood up to leave, he gathered his coat, tucked his wallet away, and walked toward the exit. The team held their breath. Then it happened. Arthur tossed the cup, not into a trash can behind his house, not into a bin he could have taken home, not into his pocket. He dropped it into a public trash can near the cafe door, a careless, ordinary action that every normal person performs without thinking. But for Regina, it felt like lightning splitting the sky. She whispered, "There it is." The moment he turned the corner, a detective stepped out of the surveillance car, gloves already on, posture steady despite the adrenaline rushing through him. He lifted the lid, retrieved the cup carefully, and sealed it inside an evidence bag. No one spoke on the drive back to the lab. No one needed to. Everyone understood what they were holding. After nearly 34 years, the man who stayed hidden had finally left something behind. For the first time, Regina allowed herself a slow exhale. They had his DNA. The cup reached the lab within minutes. No delays, no detours. Regina stood behind the glass panel, arms crossed tightly, watching the technicians prepare the sample. Everyone in that room understood what this moment meant. Decades of uncertainty balanced on a flimsy paper cup Arthur Jensen had tossed without a second thought. The test ran quietly, machines humming with the steady precision Regina had come to rely on. Seconds stretched into minutes. Minutes felt like hours. She barely blinked. Then the screen lit up. A profile emerged. A full, clean genetic signature taken from the rim of the cup, and in the next instant, the system paired it with the unknown profile pulled from Danica's suitcase. Perfect match. Regina's breath caught, the air sticking in her throat like a stone. She stepped closer to the glass, her pulse hammering in her ears. There was no room for doubt, no misread, no chance of coincidence. The man who touched the suitcase, the man who left traces inside Danica's home, the man who had evaded every database, every camera, every official record, every suspicion, Arthur Jensen. A name that had existed only in the quiet corners of a family tree was suddenly the center of everything. One of the technicians whispered, "This is him." Another said, "We finally have him." But Regina wasn't celebrating. She was staring at the screen with a cold realization tightening her spine. DNA gave them who, not why, and not how. The truth of what happened inside Danica's home the moment her morning was stolen still lived inside Arthur Jensen's silence. Now they had proof. What they didn't have was the truth. The order went out before sunrise. Regina didn't want a dramatic takedown. No sirens, no shouting, no spectacle. After 34 years of silence, this arrest needed to be quiet, controlled, the kind that mirrors the way Danica was taken. Calm on the outside, seismic underneath. They tracked Arthur to a small supermarket on the edge of town. He went there often, slipping through the aisles like a man who preferred to be overlooked. Regina watched him pull into the lot, park in the same corner space he always chose, and step out of his car with the same unhurried steps he'd used his entire life. He pushed a cart toward the entrance, never looking around, never noticing the unmarked cars parked just far enough away. The team moved in slowly, forming a loose triangle as if they were just ordinary shoppers crossing paths. Regina waited until Arthur reached the cart, returned the brief moment when both hands would be occupied, his guard at its lowest. Then she approached. "Arthur Jensen," she said, her voice steady, sharp enough to cut through the morning air. He froze, not flinching, not running, just stunned, like a man hearing his own name for the first time. Two officers stepped beside him, calm but firm, as Regina read him his rights. He didn't argue. He didn't ask questions. He didn't even blink. His face stayed strangely blank, the expression of someone whose world had just cracked open but didn't know how to react. Shoppers nearby paused mid-step, confused. A few whispered. A mother pulled her child closer. Word spread faster than the team expected. After 34 years, the man responsible for Danica's disappearance was in handcuffs. Justice wasn't finished, but it had finally begun. If staying informed keeps you safer, make sure you're subscribed. Missing updates like this could leave you blind to warning signs. News travels fast in small towns, even faster when it involves a name no one expected to hear again. Within hours of Arthur Jensen's arrest, whispers turned into conversations, conversations turned into phone calls, and phone calls turned into a wave of shock rolling through Livonia. People who had lived beside him for years felt the ground tilt beneath them. He shopped at my store. He walked past my house. My kids waved at him. How could we not have known? It wasn't fear of the man himself that rattled them. It was the realization that he had stood among them for decades, unremarkable and unnoticed. A man capable of taking someone's life had lived just down the street, blending into the quiet rhythm of ordinary days. Some residents gathered outside their homes that evening, talking in hushed voices under porch lights. Parents watched their children more closely. Elderly neighbors double-checked locks. People exchanged looks that carried one message. If he could hide this long, who else could be hiding something? Brenda heard the news from a former co-worker who practically shouted through the phone. For a moment, she didn't move. Her breath caught, her grip tightened, and her mind flashed back to the years of waiting, begging, grieving. She sank into the nearest chair, hands trembling so hard she had to steady them on her knees. Relief wasn't immediate. It came slowly, cautiously, like a door opening after decades of being sealed shut. Regina watched all of it from the sidelines. She didn't need applause. She didn't need recognition. What mattered was simple. For the first time in 34 years, the community felt the shift. The silence around Danica's case had finally broken. But this was only the surface. Arthur's arrest answered who. The next step would expose why. Arthur sat in the back of the squad car with his hands cuffed in front of him, staring straight ahead as if refusing to acknowledge the world closing in around him. For most of the ride, he stayed eerily calm, the same calm he carried through parking lots, grocery aisles, and quiet afternoons on park benches. But calm only survives as long as denial does. When they pulled into the station lot, the moment hit him. The building he had passed thousands of times now stood over him like a verdict. Officers waited at the entrance. Doors unlocked with sharp clicks. Paperwork shuffled. Voices carried. Arthur's breathing changed. Just slightly, but enough. For the first time in 34 years, he looked afraid. Regina watched him step out of the vehicle, his shoulders tense, his expression stiffening into something brittle. Not panic. Not rage. Something worse. Recognition. He understood that whatever story he'd told himself all these years, whatever lie he'd lived behind was gone. His silence, his careful habits, his planned routine, none of it could protect him anymore. As they walked him down the hallway, an officer noted the date in the logbook. The 14th of November 2021, exactly 34 years after Danica's last morning. A full lifetime between the crime and the reckoning. Inside the interrogation room, the chair waited. The recorder waited. The folder sat open on the table, with his name printed across the front. Arthur lowered himself into the seat slowly, like a man feeling the weight of every step he took. Regina stood outside the glass panel for a moment, letting the gravity of the moment settle. The arrest was done. Now came the part no one could prepare for. The truth. Arthur sat alone in the interrogation room, his wrists resting on the metal table, his eyes fixed on a spot that didn't exist. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, but he didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't look around. He sat so still he might have been made of stone. Regina entered without ceremony. She placed a thin folder on the table, the one containing the DNA report, and slid it toward him. Arthur didn't touch it. He didn't even glance at it. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "Your DNA," she said softly, "was inside Danica Morell's home." A noticeable swallow traveled down his throat. The first crack. Regina continued, her tone calm but unrelenting. On the suitcase. The one she planned to take to her parents' house. You touched it. Arthur blinked hard once. His fingers twitched. His jaw tightened a tiny movement, but enough to signal what Regina already sensed. He wasn't denying it. He was unraveling internally. For 34 years, Arthur Jensen had lived in a world of silence, a world where no one questioned him, no one connected him, no one saw him. Regina had just shattered that world in 2 sentences. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. You didn't leave the house that morning as a stranger. You left as the only person who knew what happened to her. Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, his breathing growing uneven. Not dramatic, not loud, just shaky enough to betray him. Most people imagine confessions as explosive shouting, tears, anger, but the truth is often quieter. Much quieter. Regina opened the folder and turned it so he could see the DNA report in black and white. This is you, Arthur. You know it is. His shoulders slumped. A tiny sound escaped him, something between a sigh and a surrender. The silence was breaking. Arthur didn't speak right away. His eyes stayed fixed on the DNA report, as if staring long enough might make the words rearrange themselves into something less damning. Regina didn't rush him. She knew this part the moment before the confession could take minutes or hours. But Arthur broke sooner than expected. I didn't plan to notice her, he muttered, the words scratching out of him like they'd been trapped for years. Regina stayed silent, letting him continue. Arthur's breathing grew heavier as he spoke. I worked near her office, maintenance, temporary jobs, in and out. Most people ignored me. His fingers tapped the table nervously, a rhythm of guilt he couldn't control, but she didn't. Regina's brow tightened. What do you mean? She looked at me, Arthur said. Not interested. Not like that. She just looked. Like I existed. He swallowed hard. You don't forget that when you've been invisible your whole life. The words came out small, unsettling, and soaked in the kind of entitlement that makes your skin crawl. It wasn't love. It wasn't admiration. It was fixation shaped by loneliness and resentment, 2 emotions that can become dangerous when held too long. Arthur's voice darkened. I watched her leave work, just once at first, then again. She walked with purpose. She smiled at people. She had a life that felt easy. His hands tightened into fists. I didn't have that. Regina felt her stomach turn. She'd heard this pattern before, the quiet men who linger at the edges of other people's lives, building entire fantasies in silence. He looked up, eyes empty but sharp. I started following her. Just enough to know her routine. Not enough to be noticed. That was the moment the room shifted, when admiration became possession and curiosity curdled into something far darker. Arthur Jensen didn't snap suddenly. He grew toward it. Arthur rubbed his palms together slowly, as if warming hands that had gone cold. He didn't look at Regina anymore. He looked past her, back into a memory he'd been running from for decades. That morning, he said quietly, I was already on her street. Regina noted the admission but didn't interrupt. Arthur continued, voice trembling with the weight of a choice he'd carried alone. I'd followed her home the night before. I knew she wasn't working that weekend. I saw the suitcase by the door through the window. She was leaving town. A hollow breath escaped him. She was slipping out of the world I watched her in. He clenched his jaw. I told myself I just wanted to see her one more time, that's all. But they both knew that wasn't all. He shifted in his chair, tension climbing up his spine. Around 7, I waited by the side of the house. I heard her moving around inside. I could hear normal life. Coffee. Footsteps. Cabinets closing. He swallowed hard. She had no idea I was there. Regina remained stone still. Arthur's voice cracked. When she stepped out with the suitcase, I panicked. I thought she'd see me. I thought she'd scream. So I stepped forward like I needed help. Like my car had a problem. His hands tightened into fists. She looked surprised, but she didn't run. She didn't think she needed to. The room felt colder. Arthur's next words came slower, each one pulled from him like a confession carved out of bone. I pushed past her when she turned toward the house to grab something. I followed her inside before she could close the door. She tried to stay calm, but she knew something was wrong. His breathing shook. That's where everything changed. Arthur's breathing grew heavier as he approached the part he had avoided for almost half his life. His fingers trembled on the table, and he kept rubbing his thumb as if trying to erase something from his skin. When we got inside, he said softly. She asked what I wanted. Regina didn't move. She wasn't terrified at first, Arthur added. More, startled, confused, trying to figure out if I was dangerous. He squeezed his eyes shut, but the second she saw the door close behind me, she understood. He wiped his face with both hands, leaving smudges on his cheeks. She tried to talk to me, kept her voice steady, asked if I needed help, asked if I was hurt. She was trying to calm me down. Regina felt her stomach twist. Danica had always been known for her kindness. It was exactly the kind of kindness a person like Arthur would exploit. Arthur's next words came slowly. I told her I just wanted her to listen, that I'd watched her for a long time. I thought she'd understand. I thought she'd see that I admired her. His voice cracked under the weight of his delusion. But she told me I needed to leave. He paused a long, fragile silence. That's when I lost control. He didn't slam the table. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice carried all the violence he didn't physically show. She reached for the door. I grabbed her arm. She fought hard, harder than I expected. She pulled away, tried to get to the phone, tried to yell. The room felt tight. Arthur stared at his hands. I covered her mouth. I just wanted her to stop panicking. I didn't think. His voice thinned to a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go that far. Regina's eyes hardened. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice, one he made moment by moment. And now he had to speak the final truth. Arthur's voice thinned until it sounded like he was speaking from somewhere far away, not the room, not the present, but a place he'd been trapped in for decades. When she stopped moving, he whispered, the house went quiet. Too quiet. Regina didn't blink. Arthur's eyes glistened, not with sympathy, but with the shock of someone who had replayed a moment so many times it had carved itself into his mind. I didn't know what to do. I kept waiting for her to breathe. I kept telling myself she would. He rubbed his forehead, but she didn't. The confession spilled out in fragments. I sat on the floor for a long time. I kept thinking someone would show up, a neighbor, her coworker, anyone. I expected footsteps on the porch. A knock. Something. His breath shuddered. But nothing happened. Regina watched him fold inward as he described the next steps, the steps that separated panic from intent. I carried her down the hallway. I didn't look at her face. He swallowed hard. I placed her near the back door. I thought if I moved fast I could make it look like she just left. But he knew better. Fear drove the next part. I went home. Waited until it was dark. Then I drove back with a tarp. He paused, shaking. I moved her body into my car. No one saw. It was late. Cold. Everyone was asleep. Regina's jaw tightened as Arthur finally named the destination. I drove to my family's land. The old property. No one goes there anymore. He exhaled shakily. I buried her near the tree line. Covered the ground. Walked away before sunrise. He leaned back, defeated, his voice barely audible. That's where she stayed. All these years. Because of me. The room held a heavy stillness, the kind that settles when a truth too painful to deny finally surfaces. The morning the search team arrived at the old Jensen property, the air felt heavier than normal. Not dramatic, just the type of silence that settles when everyone understands the importance of what they're about to do. The land hadn't changed much over the decades. The soil was uneven, the grass was patchy, the tree line stood like a boundary no one had crossed in years. Regina waited near the vehicles, arms folded, watching the forensic crew unpack their equipment. She'd imagined this moment for weeks, the moment the final piece of Danica's story would be pulled out of the ground. But imagining it and standing on the soil where Arthur buried her were two different things entirely. The cadaver dog handlers moved first. The dogs circled the area with sharp focus, weaving through the brush, pausing occasionally to scent the air. It didn't take long. Within minutes, one of them stiffened, lowered its nose, and pawed at a patch of earth near the edge of the woods. Everyone froze. Regina approached the spot slowly, her heart pushing hard against her ribs. This was it. This was where Arthur ended a life and pretended the world would forget. The crew marked the location and began clearing the upper layer of soil. Each scrape of the trowel cut through years of secrecy. The ground gave way piece by piece, every inch deepening the weight of what they were uncovering. A small crowd formed at the perimeter: officers, forensic staff, and silent onlookers who understood the gravity of what was happening. After a few minutes, the digging paused. A fragment of fabric appeared. Then another. Then something pale beneath the dirt, unmistakable in shape. A hush fell over the team. They had found her. The excavation slowed as the forensic team neared the deeper layers. Every movement became deliberate, almost reverent. Gloves brushed away soil with careful precision, revealing more of the fabric, then bone structure, then the unmistakable outline of a body that had waited far too long to be found. Regina stood a few feet back, her gaze fixed and unblinking. She'd been trained for moments like this, but training didn't prepare you for the sight of a life cut short and hidden away. Not after 34 years of unanswered questions. The lead forensic examiner lifted a hand. "We have human remains, female, adult." The words struck the air like a quiet verdict. The team worked methodically to preserve every fragment, documenting angles, collecting soil samples, and placing the remains into carefully cushioned containers. Each piece told a story that had been muted for decades. When they uncovered the last layer, the examiner found something small tucked beneath the degraded clothing, a bracelet, a simple silver band with one missing charm. Brenda had described it countless times during interviews. Regina's breath hitched. There was no doubt. But they still needed confirmation. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office, where dental records were compared against Danica's file from 1987. Hours later, Regina received the call. "It's her. It's Danica." She didn't respond immediately. She closed her eyes, allowing the weight of the words to sink in. This wasn't just evidence. This wasn't just closure for an investigation. This was a woman whose life had been stolen, finally identified, finally acknowledged. Down the hall, officers paused as Regina walked past, her expression steady but heavy. For 34 years the question had been, where is she? Now, at last, the world had an answer. Brenda arrived at the station shortly after the confirmation. A detective guided her to a private room, but she barely heard the instructions. Her hands shook. Her breathing was uneven. She looked like someone bracing for a truth she'd imagined countless times but never truly prepared for. Regina entered quietly, closing the door behind her. "It's her," she said softly. No dramatic build-up, no attempt to cushion the impact. Brenda had waited too long for anything less than honesty. Brenda's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the chair as tears filled her eyes. Not the soft tears of temporary sadness, but the deep, trembling grief of someone finally learning the final chapter of a story that never should have been written. She cried for the friend she lost. She cried for the years spent searching. She cried because the waiting was finally over, and because the answer hurt as much as the question. Word spread through Livonia just as quickly as the arrest had. Some residents held candles outside their homes, others prayed quietly with family. A few visited the old property line, leaving flowers, even though there was no formal memorial yet. It wasn't a celebration. It was a release, a communal exhale after decades of tension that had lingered in the air like an unresolved chord. For Regina, there was no outward display of triumph. She stood at the edge of the property the next morning, staring at the disturbed soil where workers had finished leveling the ground. She didn't smile. She didn't tear up. She simply lowered her head for a moment, honoring the woman she'd brought home. Justice had begun months earlier with DNA. Peace began here with the truth finally lifted from the earth. The courthouse in downtown Livonia had seen decades of routine hearings, traffic disputes, property battles, small-town arguments that came and went. But on the morning of Arthur Jensen's arraignment and, later, his trial, the building felt surrounded by a tension that settled over every step, every bench, every whispered conversation. People lined the sidewalks long before the doors opened. Some came out of curiosity. Others came because they remembered the flyers from 1987, the vigils in the mid-90 seconds, the renewed coverage in the 2000s. And some came because they simply needed to see him, the man who had lived among them like an ordinary neighbor while carrying the darkest secret in their town's history. Inside, the courtroom filled quickly. Wooden benches creaked as residents pressed closer, waiting for the doors to swing open. Cameras were barred from entering, but reporters crowded the hallway, scribbling notes as fast as they could. When Arthur was escorted in, he kept his head down, no arrogance, no attempt to meet anyone's eyes. His shackles clinked softly with each step, a sound that carried far more weight than its volume suggested. Brenda sat in the second row, hands clasped together tightly in her lap. She didn't blink, she didn't breathe deeply, she didn't allow herself even a moment of distraction. She needed to see him, truly see him, without the fog of years blurring the image. Regina entered last, slipping into a seat near the aisle. She didn't need attention. Her presence alone said everything. We are here because the truth finally caught up. As the judge took the bench and the courtroom rose, a silence settled that felt almost sacred. This wasn't just a trial. It was the moment Livonia had waited for since the morning Danica vanished. The prosecution opened with a clarity that stunned the room into stillness. No theatrics, no raised voices, just a sequence of facts laid out like stepping stones leading straight to one conclusion. They began with the DNA. A forensic analyst took the stand first, explaining how the sample pulled from Danica's suitcase matched Arthur Jensen with absolute certainty. The numbers didn't lie, the science didn't wobble, and the jurors leaned forward, recognizing the weight of something that could not be argued away. Next came the partial print recovered from the doorknob, faint, but distinct enough to confirm Arthur had touched the one object Danica would have used while leaving home. It wasn't a fall into speculation. It was direct contact. Then, Regina testified. Her voice stayed steady as she walked the courtroom through the cold case revival, how modern technology extracted truth from evidence once thought useless. She detailed the process that led investigators to Arthur's family branch, how surveillance confirmed his habits, and how discarded DNA sealed the case. Every word tightened the tension. Brenda listened with her hands clasped, her eyes burning with a mixture of sorrow and gratitude. She'd spent years fighting to keep Danica's memory alive. Hearing Regina explain how the past finally collided with the present felt like watching a promise being honored. Arthur's defense attempted to push back. They argued contamination, they argued coincidence, they argued the unreliability of old evidence. But their arguments fell flat, especially once the jury heard Arthur's recorded confession. His voice low, uneven, and cracking under pressure filled the courtroom. No one looked away. Not even Arthur, who stared at the table while the sound of his own admission played over the speakers. By the time the recording ended, the room understood something clearly. This wasn't a mystery anymore. It was truth, documented and undeniable. When the jury returned, the courtroom rose in one unified motion, a wave of anticipation, fear, and long-buried hope. Brenda clutched the bench so tightly her knuckles blanched. Regina's gaze remained fixed on the jurors' faces, reading the quiet resolve etched into their expressions. The four-person stood, unfolded the slip of paper, and cleared their throat. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Arthur Jensen, guilty. The words struck the room like a release valve bursting open. Brenda let out a choked breath, not joy, not triumph, but a deep, shaken exhale she'd been holding for 34 years. Her shoulders trembled. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain this time, but from something closer to peace. Arthur didn't lift his head, he didn't fight, he didn't shout. He simply stared forward, as if the final thread of denial had snapped the moment the word guilty left the four-person's lips. The judge wasted no time. Arthur Jensen, you are sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. No murmurs, no outbursts, just a heavy, collective silence. Outside, the community reacted in layers, some with tears, some with quiet nods, others with a long, overdue sigh. Conversations broke out across porches, diners, and sidewalks. People revisited old fears, old memories, old warnings they once brushed aside. A few placed flowers near the station, honoring the woman they lost, and the justice finally delivered. Regina stepped out of the courthouse into the cool afternoon air. There was no celebration in her posture. No victory speech. Just a long breath, a slow nod, and the steady understanding that her work had brought a family and an entire town the truth they deserved. For the first time since 1987, Livonia felt lighter. Justice had arrived. In the days following the verdict, Livonia moved through a strange mix of relief and reflection. Life didn't return to normal, it reshaped itself. People walked a little slower. They noticed the faces around them. They paid closer attention to the quiet ones who drifted through crowds without leaving an impression. Brenda visited the memorial that had formed near the edge of the old property. Flowers, handwritten notes, and small candles lined the ground. She knelt beside them, letting her fingers trace the name she'd spoken for 3 decades. The sadness was still there, sharp and familiar, but this time it came with clarity instead of uncertainty. She deserved better, she whispered. And she did. Regina watched from a distance, giving Brenda the space she'd earned. She knew this wasn't just about one case. It was a reminder of something people rarely want to confront. Danger doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't roar. Sometimes it stands quietly in checkout lines, nods politely at neighbors, and blends into ordinary days until a single moment exposes everything. That's the lesson Danica leaves behind, not fear, but awareness. The kind that sharpens instincts and reminds people to trust the warnings they feel, even when nothing looks wrong on the surface. As the sun dipped behind the trees, Regina finally turned to leave. She'd closed the case, but the impact would ripple through the town for years. Through every mother who checked in with her child, every co-worker who noticed something off, every neighbor who paid closer attention. And now, here's the part viewers need to hear. If a case like this unfolded in your town, would you want to hear about it too late? Subscribe now. Staying unaware is the real danger. And for those who still refuse, tell us why in the comments. We're listening, and someone else might learn from your hesitation.